Welcome back to Happiness in Progress. I'm your host, Danielle Craig. I'm an Emmy Award winner, former journalist, mom, wife, and I like to say, just a person looking for more joy. This podcast is brought to you by the Mail Tribune. It's all about finding more happiness in all aspects of your life. Here you will learn perspective, hope, unity, strength, and tangible tips to bring more joy into your everyday. Remember, tickets are on sale right now for the first ever Happiness in Progress live event. There will be a dinner, swag, a beautiful setting at Roxanne Winery in Southern Oregon. And most importantly, we're going to be digging deep on self-worth issues, perfectionism, expectations, shame, and how to get out of that. You are going to leave feeling empowered and rejuvenated. It's happening in July. Grab a friend to get the special two-for deal. The website is linked in show notes. Now let's get to today's guest. Meet Lydia Fenet.
It's another thing that we all do. It's just sort of like, well, what happens if? What if we do this? What if? But what if we'll just keep you in the exact place that you are with no growth for the rest of your life?
Lydia is the managing director and global director of strategic partnerships at Christies. She has raised more than $500 million for nonprofits worldwide as the leading benefit auctioneer in the country. Let that sink in. $500 million. And most recently, Lydia became an author, releasing the book, The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You. This book has received praise from many women nationwide, including Barbara Corcoran, Martha Stewart, and Arianna Huffington. Lydia and her achievements have been featured on The Today Show, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Vogue, and many more. Lydia, in this podcast, opens up about getting her role, authenticity, overcoming fear, and how when things don't go our way, sometimes it's for the better, how we can grow from disappointment, and how to become the most powerful woman in the room. This is one of my favorite conversations, so let's get to it. Let's start with you just telling me a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in a small town in Louisiana called Lake Charles, and I lived there until I was about 13, and then I left to go to boarding school in the Northeast, which I think was a pretty fundamental thing for me in life. I feel like a lot of my independence came from having gone away at such an early age. But after being in the Northeast for 4 years and dealing with sort of snowstorm after snowstorm, I decided it was time to go back down south and went back down to the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee for college. And the unusual thing about Sewanee is they have a program with Oxford University because the school was actually founded by bishops from Oxford University. So there are a lot of parallels with the way that the education is presented to the students, and there's a great sort of junior year abroad program. And interestingly, my mom is British and grew up in Oxford. So I'd always had this tie to this small town. And so my junior year, for the first semester, I went to Oxford. And that was really the first time I became interested in art and art history. And it was, if I look back over the course of my life, there have been all of these touch points where I can point at something specifically and say, that is the reason that I made this choice, or that is the reason that this happened. Wow. At some point during my time at Oxford, I read an article about women who worked in the auction world. And there was something about the article that just captured my imagination. And, they talked a lot about the job itself, but also the sort of woman who worked there, who traveled internationally and interfaced with all of these incredible clients. And they even talked about, what she wore, which for me, I've always loved dressing up. I mean, Sewanee had a coat and tie and student upheld dress code. So, I was sort of always dressed up from day one. And there was just something about the entire picture that seemed great to me. Mm-hmm. And so I applied for an internship that summer and got the internship after sort of wiggling my way into an internship program that was already full. And then I started right after college. I went back for another short internship and was hired out of that internship. And so I've been there for 20 years, and I've had such an interesting career, not only because I started off in events, but then started my own department 10 years in, but also because I've had this incredible opportunity to be a charity auctioneer, which it used to be sort of almost like the sort of smaller stepsister that nobody really paid much attention to because everyone was always talking about art auctioneering and the Picassos and the Monets. But the charity auctioneering was something that I loved so much and I did so much of that it really became as important in my role at Christie's as my full-time job there, even though it's a volunteer service from the company. So that I think has been, for me, one of the most exciting and interesting parts of my job, and has really been the thing that prompted me to write the book. I mean, the experiences that I've had on stage raising money for nonprofits around the world has really been the catalyst for all of this, which has been really exciting.
Yeah. What's the number that you've raised for nonprofits?
So I've raised over $500 million. I've been taking auctions since I was 24. I know.
It's unreal.
It's a staggering number. Well, it was funny because somebody asked me after I'd written the book, when we were talking about the book flap, they said, could you just come back to us and let us know how much you've raised? And I never really thought about it as a sum total. I always thought about it as, I made, this was the charity auction where we made $15 million. Or, there was always sort of that, how much is the most you've ever made question. But then I sort of sat down and I was like, okay, I've been taking 70 to 100 auctions a year. And I started looking through the totals, and I've been doing it for 16 years. And all of a sudden the number is getting past 500 million. And I was like, wow, that's a crazy number if you really say it out loud. And so it takes people's breath away. They're like, $500 million? No, surely you mean $500,000. No, $500 million. It's like that Austin Powers moment, $500 million.
When you looked at that number for the first time, did you have any specific feelings about the impact you've been able to help make?
I mean, I feel it so deeply when I'm on stage, and even when I get off stage, because it's being on stage in front of people, you're seeing real time what is in their faces and in their emotions. And, I'll get off stage and I'll have an executive director standing next to me. And there's one in particular who's very emotive, and he just grabs me and holds on to me and cries. And he's like, you're doing God's work. Like, this is God's work. And of course, then I cry because I'm a huge crier. But I mean, I stand on stage and raise money for pediatric cancer, and I get on always. I mean, this is really the toughest part of my job, is that I always get on right after the person who comes on to give the appeal. They put on somebody whose child has passed away of pediatric cancer, and then I get on stage, and of course I'm weeping openly as I get on stage. But I've learned that those emotions are actually very true and very real to the audience. And if I show those emotions, then the audience understands that I too feel what they feel at that moment. Yeah. And I think that's important.
You're a human being. I think that is important. I love the title of your book, The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You. And really, when you lead a benefit auction like this, as the auctioneer, that's you, the most powerful woman in the room. Tell me about the first time that you realized this. You looked around this room, high-powered people, people who have a lot of money, people who a lot of us are probably familiar with, movie stars, different kind of stars. When did you have that aha moment? Oh my goodness, I've got a ton of power right now.
I think it was the first time that I did a paddle raise, which it makes no sense unless you've been to a charity auction, but I will try to explain it. Essentially, you are on stage and you've done the live auction portion of the evening. So you've auctioned off everything that everybody wants, a vacation home or a dinner with, Matt Damon or something like that. And then you get to the end, and it's called different things, but a paddle raise or a live appeal. And essentially what I'm asking the audience to do is simply raise their paddle and give money. And typically what I'll ask the audience to do is listen for a minute as I explain what that money can do towards the organization. So, $500 can help keep a child from drowning, because you can give them swimming lessons over the summer so that when they go on a trip, if they don't know how to swim, they are therefore in a situation where they're not going to drown if they jump in because they're worried about their peers thinking they can't swim or something like that. And I stood on stage at a paddle raise once, and the paddle raise had always been kind of the flat part of the evening because it just felt very dead after the live auction. And so really it was this sort of shift in mindset where I decided that the audience needed to be motivated not as a group of individuals giving $500, or in this case, it was a lot more, it was $25,000, but rather every single person in the audience, whether they were giving $100 at the last part of the paddle raise, or if they were giving the starting bid at $25,000, needed to feel like they were part of something. And so I have this weird ability, although I will tell you my whole life, I never thought that I was good at math. I have this very weird ability to add very quickly in my head. And what I've realized is if I throw out a number that's a goal to the audience, and then I add towards that number and just sort of keep them involved in the process, all of a sudden they're all rooting for us to hit that number as well. So I'll set sometimes it's an arbitrary goal, just something that I think, the audience might be able to get to based on what they did the year before. And then I'll start it out. So let's start at $100,000, right? Is there anyone here who could give 25? And I typically know going in that there's one person who can raise at the really high level, because otherwise it really does kill the energy in the room. Mm-hmm. But then from that moment on, as I go down, anyone at 25, and we have one. So now we only have to raise $75,000. And I just keep doing that until we get to those low numbers. And I just keep messaging to the crowd, if you are not bidding right now, your applause is as important as those bids. This is going to take energy and it's going to take motivation, and then everybody feels like they're part of it. And I just really drive them into that vision. And at the end, it's amazing to see. I get goosebumps every single time we hit the goal. And the audience, it's like a swell of applause as we get closer and closer and closer. And I usually end with the person who raises their hand for the last bid is always the person who gets the most applause. And so then 15 hands go up and we actually always go over the goal. But I think standing on stage during those moments where I understand that I can actually make the crowd do something, like I can make them be quiet, or I can make them give money, or I can push them to bid one more thing. That's when I started to feel powerful. And that aha moment for me was when I realized I got on stage in front of 1,000 people, and I wasn't scared at all of the crowd. I wasn't scared of them talking. I wasn't scared of them doing anything. I felt completely in control of the room and felt like no matter what happened in front of me, I could handle it and move them forward and get the money that I needed to get.
That is so cool. It's amazing. So I loved reading your book because I have emceed a ton of events. I MC events regularly. I'm emceeing an event today. But
okay, good. There we go.
I did my first auction about, weeks ago. And I was not the auctioneer, but I was introducing the different things people could bid on. And as I was doing this, I realized this was not like a regular event that I'd emceed, because it was really difficult to get the crowd to quiet. They'd been there, drinking and eating for the last 2 hours. And I was stunned. And I want to bring this up because this is hard what you do, getting the attention of the crowd. It was hard what I was trying to accomplish there. So how was it hard in the beginning, or have you always been able to get that attention of the crowd?
Oh my gosh. No, you have hit the nail on the head. It's the greatest fear of charity auctioneers that I train. And when I train them, I actually, whenever I'm doing the tryouts for the charity auctioneers who ultimately become the auctioneers for Christies, I get them up on the rostrum, which is the sort of podium. And then I have everyone in the entire room just talk nonstop for the next 5 minutes. And what I always say to them is, your role right now is to just keep going. You have to just keep going, because the bottom line is the people who are going to bid will keep bidding. But sometimes there are going to be instances where it does not matter what you do, people are not going to pay attention. So you have to be unafraid and just keep going. But that really is, like, when I first started taking auctions, it was the most soul-crushing thing in the entire world, because you get on stage and a lot of people don't even know that there's an auction. Most people are just coming in for a dinner, so why are they going to listen to you while you're on stage when they have A, no intention of bidding, and B, they just want to hang out with their friends? And so basically what I was saying about being powerful in that room is when I realized that I had to employ the tricks that I have learned over literally 16 years of taking auctions to keep the crowd either quiet or quiet enough or engaged enough that they will listen. And so I do a variety of different things when I'm up there. Anything from as tiny as, you have children, so I'll say, okay, ladies and gentlemen, could you, I'll always try to win over one table. If I'm seated at a table, I'll try to get those people on my side. I'll be like, table 10, it's very annoying for me to have to shush the crowd. Could you guys help me and do that right now? And the crowd will actually do it for me, which is very helpful. Or, I'll say to the audience something like, can I tell you guys, I have to tell you a quick secret. And they'll always quiet. It's like children. I'm like, a quick secret at 11 o'clock at night. And I'm like, yep, I'm just kidding. But look, you can be quiet. You have proven it to yourself. You can all be quiet. So I think it's just, you have to just play with them almost. You have to make them part of it.
Wow.
And then the other thing that I say, and I say this in the book too, but you just have to remember that, especially in a situation like a charity auction or an emceeing or anything like that, you can't make it seem like you're talking at the crowd, because what involves them and what engages them is feeling like they're part of the performance. So I pick people out throughout the evening, whether or not they're bidding. I'll just sort of casually throw in something, to the gentleman who's like picking up his phone. I'm like, I'm sure, sir, that you are picking up your phone to check out the things on this lot. Obviously, this man had no intention of bidding on anything, but his phone is all of a sudden down on the table and he's engaged and his table is engaged to see what happens. Or, sir, I assume you're checking your bank to make sure that the money that you're about to dump into my paddle raise, or, something like that can be a very effective way to just engage people throughout the evening.
That sounds really fun.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip forward a little bit, but we'll come back to where we are, because I want to go to being you in doing this. So there was a way that auctioneers were, and you read about that. And this goes toward anything somebody wants to be. There's a way that it's done,
Right.
But you decided, I'm going to do this my way. Tell me about that.
When I first started taking auctions, I was 24 years old, and you try out at Christie's. So, you go into an auction room with about 20 other people, and it's a 4-day process, and they eliminate people every single day. And so at that point, pretty much every single auctioneer, I think with the exception of one, was a man. And they were typically in their sort of 50s, 60s, or 70s, and had been doing it for a very long time. And, they took charity auctions the same way that people took art auctions. And art auctions are, you're walking into a sale room. It's a very calm, reserved environment. All the chairs are facing forward. Everyone's listening. You could literally hear a pin drop during an auction. And the auctioneer is a master because he's taking auctions from the phone bids. He's taking auctions from the people seated. I mean, if you've ever seen a movie with an auction, you've seen what this kind of looks like. Mm-hmm. A charity auction is completely different. A charity auction, people have been drinking. As I said earlier, they don't even really know that there's an auction most of the time. So there's just a very different environment. And so, in my opinion, you needed a very different style to engage that audience. But everyone that I saw taking charity auctions was taking them exactly like they were taking art auctions. And they would always say to me, I just really hate taking the charity auctions. It's so like no one ever pays attention to, nobody cares that I'm up there. I leave. No one even remembers that I was there. And I just remember thinking, yeah, no, you're totally right. I'm watching this real time. You are completely right. All of those things. But there has to be a different way to do this. So when I first started taking auctions, I took it exactly the way I had been taught. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be a 7-year-old British man. I'm going to stand on stage and I'm going to sell this house in Mexico the same way that I would sell a Picasso. But the difference there was that the crowd was different and their expectations for entertainment, even though they didn't know it at the time, were very different. And so I say in the book, I had this formative moment where I was very, very, very sick, and I still had to take an auction one night because there was just no one else to take it. And so I sort of dragged myself to this event venue. And I'm sitting in a chair next to the stage, and the adrenaline rush that you get when you go on stage usually can pep you up. And I can tell you, because I've taken auctions during 3 pregnancies, despite horrible morning sickness,
wow.
The adrenaline was the only time I felt good was actually being on stage. But at the time, I didn't know any of this. And so I was just sort of sitting there, and they introduced me, and the adrenaline kind of pepped me up, but it didn't pep me up to be the sort of 70-year-old British gentleman who was elegantly taking an auction. In fact, it just sort of boosted me back to zero. And zero for me is, just talking to people the way that we're talking now. And so I got up at the rostrum and I looked out into the audience, and the first lot was this auction lot that was talking about this beautiful cocktail party for 20 people at this big art collector's home. And, that it's the kind of thing that could be very intimidating. But the woman who the cocktails were taking place in her home, and I had been seated next to each other at a lunch one day when this guy who I thought I was going to marry broke up with me out of left field. So it had happened the night before. I was a disaster. Really, I had not stopped crying since I'd left his apartment. And then I was supposed to be the head of the event. So I was supposed to be sort of in control of this entire event. And I was seated next to her, and I think about a minute into the initial conversation, I just started to cry. And so she sort of, handed me a napkin, and then she handed me her napkin, and then it was sort of like the tablecloth. I mean, anything she could sort of stop the tears. And then it was, maybe some chocolate, and then maybe a glass of wine. How about a bottle of wine? I mean, by the end, I was just like openly weeping to her at this lunch, and she could not have been sweeter. And so I sort of started off, and I was about to start off telling everyone about the specifics of this cocktail party. And all of a sudden I was just sort of like, you know what? Maybe they'd rather hear about this really cool woman and how much fun they're going to have with her. And the rest of it could kind of just be the backdrop. And so I said to everyone, I have no doubt that you're going to have the most fabulous time at this woman's apartment. You will have wonderful cocktails and beautiful hors d'oeuvre, and you're going to see this incredible art collection. But more importantly, I sat next to her after I was dumped by the love of my life. And oh my God, this woman is Oprah. You have no idea the wisdom that she gave me. If you have a therapist, this would be a great way to not have to pay for it. Just go hang out at her house, bring 19 of your friends, and you guys can just hash through the world's issues. And it was one of those things that, again, when I go back to the formative moments in my life, it was that moment where all of a sudden the crowd kind of paused, and it was like the record scratch, like, wait, what did she just say? And I sort of watched, this sort of amused smiles. She was laughing. A couple of people at her table were laughing, and people turned around, and then they bid, and they really bid on it. And so the next lot had something to do with a house in Mexico, and probably sold, different houses in Mexico 1 billion times at that point. And I sort of started off something. I mean, I was young at this point. I was like, if Mexico is like it is for me, I mean, this really conjures up memories of Senior Frogs and slides and like, thankfully not signing that Girls Gone Wild waiver that was shoved in my face at 4 a.m. But this will not be your experience because you will be staying at a luxury house. And there was a man who literally turned his chair around and is staring at me at this point. And I'm like, oh, here we go. And an auctioneering coach had said to me when I tried out, she was like, she'd been an acting coach. She said, you're great at playing auctioneer, but it's what you say when you put the microphone down that I'd like to hear more of. And all of a sudden that comment clicked for me. And in so many ways, I was like, okay, this is it. This is what she meant. Mm-hmm. And so that's how my style evolved. And so that was probably 10 years ago. And now I have one sentence when I get on stage, but, I talk about selling to groups of people all the time. And I say to them, it's not actually about what you're selling. It's how you sell it. Mm-hmm. It's how you position it. It's how you make it relatable. It's how you make it interesting. And for me, it's about how I use my humor to engage people into that process.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you are being authentic.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so much easier. It's actually really difficult to sell or pretend that you are someone that you're not, and try to sort of do things through the prism of someone that you're not. It's much easier to just get on stage with a microphone for me and sort of, go to town on everything that I see in front of me and talk about sort of a conscious stream of thought of things that are coming out of my brain as I'm on stage. It just makes it much easier and much more fun.
Mm-hmm. How do you think someone listening can use that advice to be authentic in their lives and get so much power from that?
Well, I do think that we all have this opportunity because ultimately we're all taught to do things by other people. And, especially if you're coming out of, I always say that the first chapter of your life is sort of 0 through 21, where you're getting to the point when you hit 21, where everyone has been teaching you things up until that age. It's like your teachers or your parents, or everyone has been giving you thoughts on how you should be thinking. And then from 21 to the next whenever is when you really get to figure out how you're going to implement those things in your own life. And so think about what you've been taught, but think about how you can make it your own, because using your own voice is what's going to make you confident at the end of the day.
It seems like it wasn't that hard for you to get to that authentic part of yourself, at least on this specific evening, because you just didn't have anything to give to become that British auctioneer. Do you feel like it was a long road to get there?
Oh, I mean, that was year 5. At that point, I'd probably taken 500 auctions, 500 very mediocre auctions where people didn't pay attention to me, as we were talking about earlier. So wow. Just to have a spark of something that I was like, this could actually make this better. This could make this process work better. Yeah, I mean, it was a road and it was a journey. And in a way, I'm glad I had it, because you really could put me on any stage anywhere and anything could happen. And I've seen it before. It was part of a journey of self-discovery that got me to that place. And even since then, I mean, that auction went well, but then I say to people, if I have 5 auctions in a week, 2 will be great, 2 will be mediocre, and 1 will be like, that wasn't great. And now, I mean, that if I said that would be 10 years ago. But now, if I have 5 auctions in a week, 4 of them will be great, and 1 of them will be like, what could I have changed to make that one better? And that's a great feeling.
Yeah. How do you not get held up on the one that could have been better? How do you not let that destroy your confidence?
Well, it's tough. I mean, that I think is the thing that we all struggle with the most, right? It's the one review that's negative that you just can't get out of your mind. But especially with the auctioneering, and I say this to everyone I teach, I get on stage, I do the absolute best that I can time after time. And then if something doesn't go as well as I hoped, the next time I fix it. But that's the way you have to approach life. I mean, you can't not do things because you're scared of the outcome. And I think that's another thing that we all do. It's just sort of like, well, what happens if? What if we do this? What if? But what if will just keep you in the exact place that you are with no growth for the rest of your life? And so with those auctions, even if they go horribly, and there have been ones that, I get off stage and people are just like, oh, that was really tough. I'm like, yeah, no, I know I was on stage. Trust me, I know more than anyone. But you just have to get back up and keep going. I actually, at a talk recently, this woman said to me, we were talking about rejection, and she said, yeah, I worked at a call center for 5 years, so I like to think that I'm bulletproof. And I was like, I think that's actually the best thing I've ever heard in my life, bulletproof, because rejection just, it rolls off your back.
I love this, what you wrote in your book in the chapter about failing, you wrote, quote, "You never know what opportunity that failure will bring or how it will open a door that you didn't even see because you were so focused on the intended outcome. Be open to everything. Understand that being in second or third place, or in some cases, never achieving a particular goal, may be teaching you a valuable lesson you can use to get where you want, taking a different path from how you first thought you would get there." End quote. Tell me a little bit about discovering that.
So I played on 3 teams in middle school for 4 years that never won a game. So I actually am bulletproof too. Yeah, volleyball, basketball, and track. I was at a small private school, and we had, I think on my basketball team, there were 6 of us, 6 players, and we would lose games like 52
so
to
hard.
6. I mean, it wasn't even, we had no offense, we had no defense. Even there were games where people were told not to raise their hands to defend us, but we didn't have any offense, so it didn't matter.
Wow.
So I think that from a very early age, I just realized, you go out there, you give it your all, and then you just kind of walk away, and it is what it is. And it was interesting because I left, as I said earlier, I left a small town in Louisiana, and I went to a boarding school in the Northeast. And it's a very different thing in the Northeast. I mean, sports are as important as football is in Louisiana. That's like women's lacrosse. And so I sort of stumbled onto this campus, and all of a sudden I'm looking at sports I'd never seen in my entire life, and playing on teams. And because I'm tall and I've always been a runner and I'm fast, they would sort of, I started playing lacrosse, and they were sort of like, you have no stick skills, but you can catch the ball once and then just run it to the end of the field. So that'll work. And so that seemed like a good plan to me. And so I played lacrosse. And I mean, I remember we would lose a game, and there would be people throwing sticks and tears. And I was just sort of like, what is the point of this? I mean, we get another opportunity next week. That's what a sports team is, right? We have another opportunity to come out here and try again. And again, those moments in life, I just remember thinking to myself, this is important because knowing that I have this skill, this ability to brush off failure in my life is going to be something that I just need to go back to time and time again, because it's going to happen to all of us. And you just have to understand that, I didn't get into my first or second choice college, but I went to Sewanee and could not have had a better college experience if I tried. I loved every second of it, but don't think that I didn't cry for days when I didn't get into those first 2 colleges. And, it all worked out. Look, I say that all the time. Whatever happens, it always works out. Sometimes not in the way that you thought, but sometimes in the ways that are totally unexpected. Because if I hadn't gone to Sewanee, I wouldn't have gone to Oxford. If I hadn't gone to Oxford, I probably wouldn't be at Christies.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? It's so interesting to look back at what we thought was supposed to happen contrasted with what actually happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there a moment where people, after a failure or after something that they wanted to happen didn't happen the way that they thought it should, that they can make a choice where they decide, this is going to serve me, this failure will serve me, or it won't serve me?
Yes, I think that there's always that opportunity. I think time makes everything easier, right? So it's easy for me to look back and say, well, I didn't get into the colleges I wanted to get into, but those were devastating moments, devastating. And so I would say if you're someone who's listening to this, especially in your sort of 20s and 30s, when there are decisions that do feel life crushing at the time because you don't have extra years of experience, having gone through these things time and time again to sort of numb the pain, if you will. Just understand that there's a larger playbook. You're looking at it as a very short game right now, but life is long, and there are many opportunities to correct things that you don't like the outcome of, but you're the only person who can do it. So the other thing I encourage people to do is really don't look around and think that someone else is going to create your roadmap for you. You really need to be the person who is sitting down and figuring out what you want for yourself in your life and making those decisions as a result of it.
What do you think stands in the way between people and their goals?
I think fear more than anything. And, I see this in men and in women, but especially in women.
Yeah.
They're scared that someone's going to think that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or they're scared of what other people are going to think about them. Or, all these sort of questions and, well, what if I go into that salary negotiation and they say no, and then they think that I've asked for too much and that I'm too aggressive. I'm like, well, who cares? I mean, at the end of the day, if you got what you wanted, then does it really matter? And I think that that's a constant,
Yeah.
That's a constant message that I hear. That's a constant worry that I hear when I speak to young women. And frankly, I've said on more than one occasion during speeches about the book, I feel like women are constantly asking for permission to do something that we already have permission to do. Like there's no permission needed to do a lot of the things that we're all like, well, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could go in for this. Again, I go back to salary negotiation, but that could be anything. And I think that, as I've said many times, I'm like, if this hot pink book gives you that permission that you need, then take it and use this as your excuse to do whatever you want with your life, because there's really no barrier and there's no boundary. We just do it to ourselves.
How does that feel to be the person saying, here is your permission, go do it?
It feels actually natural to me. I feel like this is the way I've always lived my life. And I mean, I can't tell you how many friends I have said to over the years, if you could only see what I see in you, you would understand that your potential is limitless. You are doing this to yourself. So just stop worrying, just try it, go for it, do it. And I think that's just, this book just amplifies that message to a larger audience, which I'm thrilled about.
It's very cool. It's amazing. I love the book.
Thank you.
For someone who is afraid of all the things you mentioned and they've got this fear, how to move past that? Anything other than just the permission?
I think you have to understand for that person, and for every other person out there who's nodding as you say that, we all feel that fear, all of us. I mean, I can remember as a child, my dad used to always make us ask for things. Like we would have to go to, like a vending machine or a vendor and ask them for an extra fork for lunch or something really small that even as a child, you just feel like you don't want to do. He would say, no, I'm not giving you my fork. You need to go ask for your own fork. You need to ask for things, because sometimes he's like, what's the worst they can say? It's no. And so I would say to anyone listening who has that worry in life, you just have to fight through it and understand. I think sometimes just hearing that other people feel the same way is helpful, that everybody feels that way. Even when I was writing the book, I had case studies in the book from over 30 women. And when I had to write each of these women, some of them I knew, some of them I didn't. And then there were a lot of other people that I asked who either didn't get back to me or couldn't do it. Like even hitting the send button made me kind of feel like, oh God, here we go. I've got to just press the send button. And I wrote a book called The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You. Like really, I should be the person who's just, just shooting off emails one after another. So just understand that we all feel that way. But, even if you need a friend to just sort of say, I need a little bit of support to get through this, just give yourself permission to do it, but also understand that we all feel that way. It's not just you.
That's such great advice. And I love that we live in an age where we really only have to have this confidence for a millisecond to just press send. Just press send and move forward.
It's so true. It's sort of like, and now I'm hiding behind my computer.
You just close the computer, walk away.
I know.
You mentioned the case studies, and I really liked this in the book, how you ask different women how they kind of employed some of these different strategies you talk about. What was one of the pieces of advice that came back to you that really hit you?
Oh gosh, I loved them all. But the one that really stuck with me, and I've used it since so many times, is Gemma Burgess, who talks about seeking out advice from older women when she was in her 20s and living in London, perpetually broke and perpetually single. And she said, I would take any woman who seemed self-assured out to coffee and ask them to talk about themselves because everyone loves to talk about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that the best advice she ever received from a woman about negotiation was make them wince, because if you didn't make them wince, you didn't ask for enough money. And I remember thinking that's so genius, because it really is such like you just have to go for a bigger number than you would originally thought. And I think that we never think about that. It's like, oh, well, maybe if I ask for 2%, I'm like, then you'll get nothing. Whereas if you ask for 50%, then you might get 2%, but then at least you've gotten more than you would have asked if you'd asked for 2%.
Mm-hmm.
So the make them wince just seemed to me to be such like a make them wince and just be unabashed in asking, because I have so many guy friends who are like that. And it really is, it's amazing for me to watch. And I always bounce ideas off of them, because I think that I learn so much from my guy friends, because they do go into negotiation with just such a different expectation and just no fear, which is amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had my husband talk me through negotiations, which has been so helpful.
Yeah.
Which is really the reason why I've been successful in negotiating throughout my career, was because I had my husband in my ear teaching me how he went in to do negotiations.
Yes, absolutely.
It's unbelievable that we still have all of this fear around this in 2019.
I know. But I think, the importance about podcasts or writing books that open these conversations is, again, it's the openness around the conversation that makes it less scary. Because, even 5 years ago, a lot of these conversations weren't taking place. So I think it's a fantastic resource and tool for younger women or women our age or women who are older than us, who are sort of stuck in a rut in their lives, to just hear a different take and a little bit of encouragement, because sometimes, hearing a little encouragement on the right day just takes you pretty far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. You've always had a lot of confidence. Have you had to grow into that confidence as an auctioneer?
Absolutely. And I mean, I've had a lot of confidence, but I also have had a lot of self-doubt as well along the way. I think until I really sort of, I think probably in my mid to late 20s was when I really started to feel more confident. In my 30s for me was definitely a point where I felt like I had experience and I felt comfortable in my own skin in a way that made everything a lot easier. But yeah, I think you grow into confidence as you get older, frankly. It's hard to be confident when you're in your teen years, sort of discovering your own life and your own body, and even in your 20s as you're discovering your path. But I think, regardless of whether or not you have it when you're born, it's something that you can certainly grow into. And for me, being an auctioneer has been very helpful in that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think getting up in front of these huge audiences of people has helped you in your personal life as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a two-way street. I mean, I live in New York City. I see a lot of the people that I take auctions in front of, and they'll come up to me afterwards and say, oh, I saw that auction last night. It was great, or something like that. So that gives me a confidence boost as well. And I think, it's sort of, you grow in both ways, right? I'm sort of growing on my own because I'm feeling more powerful while I'm on stage, but then also getting feedback from people who are like, that was incredible. You just raised all of that money. That feels good too.
What would be your advice to becoming more confident?
Again, I think a lot of it just has to go into sort of a self-discovery mode of digging very deep and figuring out what in you is stopping you from doing the things that you want to do. Because ultimately, confidence is just the opposite of being fearful in many ways. When you're scared about something and you're not trying something, you don't feel confident. But when you do feel confident, you're not scared of anything and you just sort of go forward. So I think really sitting down and figuring out, like, why am I not doing this? Like, write it down on a piece of paper. What am I scared of in, this conversation? What am I scared of in trying to start a new business? What am I scared of, if I'm running for the head of the PTA and I'm not going to get it or something? I mean, in any facet of your life, I think just understanding what's holding you back is part of the fear. I mean, part of the way that you gain confidence. People have asked me a lot of people have asked me actually about writing the book. What were you scared of with writing the book? Were you scared about people not buying it? Were you scared about people not liking it? And the thing that I was the most fearful of was at work, people not liking the book at work, or feeling that, somehow this company that I worked for 20 years was disappointed in the fact that I'd written openly about my experience with negotiation in the company. And, out of this entire process, I would say that the only time that I had a sleepless night was when I turned the book in to my boss for the first read. And I really did not sleep. I was like, oh my God, what if she hates it? What if because we've actually worked together now for, over 20 years. And just the thought that internally everybody would be like, oh, this book is terrible. That was a very scary moment for me. But I'd written my truth and I felt like I needed to say it. And so I'd sort of made my peace with either way, but it definitely was a frightening moment.
Mm-hmm. So that's why it's important to understand what is causing the fear, what is causing the lack of confidence, is that you can make your peace with it. Is that right?
Exactly. And then you're being honest and you're being forthright, because that makes it all easier. It's easy to be confident when you know that you're telling the truth. And that's very much how I felt. And I remember saying it to my husband, I'm like, as I'm talking myself in circles while they're reading the book, I was like, this is my truth. This is my experience. This is what I have learned from it. And I feel like it's important to pass it along. And he's just sort of nodding because I was just agreeing with myself at that point. But I do think that that's a very, it's scary sometimes to put yourself out there, but you have to understand why you're scared, and then you should work through it because you'll get better results at the end of it.
Mm-hmm. And it's scary to take on something new, to have been an auctioneer for all of these years and to proven yourself over and over and over again, and then decide, you know what, I'm going to do something totally new and write a book. Tell me about the kind of maybe some self-doubt that came with that.
Oh, until the last part of it. I remember sitting at a lunch with a friend who her mother-in-law is Swedish, and she said she was telling her mother-in-law about me, and her mother-in-law turned to me and said, "Oh, so you're an author?" And I was like, "No, I'm not an author." She goes, "You're a writer?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm not. I'm an auctioneer. I run a department at Christies. I'm not a writer." She's like, "Well, you wrote a book." And I was like, "Yes, actually, you're right. I am a writer." That is true. I did, but I'd never sort of taken on that mantle. I'd never thought about it as an extension of what I had done in my career. I very much identified with being an auctioneer and running a department for Christies as well. But after, having published the book now and being on a book tour and things like that, it's certainly a title that I'm loving.
When did you realize you needed to write this book?
So I started talking about the book about 6 years ago. In one of the best days of my life, Uma Thurman and her agent saw me at an auction and asked me to go out for breakfast. And we went out for breakfast. And up until that point, over the course of my career, there have been many times where people had approached me when I got off stage and asked me if I would be interested in being on a reality show or heading up a group at a private wealth company, or just all of these different positions that I didn't really have any interest in. And I'd gone through the exploration mode with all of them. I'd met with all of these different people and heard more and more about all of these different opportunities. But again, nothing really appealed to me because I hadn't put pen to paper. Like, I didn't realize what I wanted. And so when Uma and her agent Jason asked if I wanted to go out for breakfast, I just realized it was this opportunity I shouldn't squander. And so I sat down with a piece of paper and a pen and I wrote all of the things that I would want, like what I wanted. Mm-hmm. And at the top of it, it was write a book. And it was, write a book about selling, about motivating people, specifically women, about what I'd seen on stage. But, as a mom of three, you will know this too. I was pregnant when we had breakfast that morning. And then, I basically had 3 children in 4.5 years. So, every idea I had was sort of thrown into late night feedings, and all of these ideas and sort of dreams that I had about writing this book were just shoved to the back. And I had a New York Times reporter call me out of the blue when I was pregnant with my last child and said that she wanted to write a day in the life piece about how I have a full-time job at Christie's, and then I go back out at night and have this sort of night job as an auctioneer. And I sort of, was telling her about everything in my life. And since the last time I had seen her, I'd had 2 children and gotten married and was about to have my 3rd. And she was like, "I love this even more because now there's this added layer of being a working mom. So I'm going to follow you for an entire day, and then I'll write the transcript." And she did all of those things. And then when she sent me the transcript, the last thing she'd asked me after I got off stage was, "What do you do when you get home from an auction?" And I said, well, I don't want to watch TV because it just completely amps me up. So I either read a book or I write this book that I've been writing, which was kind of not entirely true. There was not much of a book. It was like a chapter and a half really at that point. But when she sent the transcript back to me, I had another formative moment where I just was looking at this piece of paper and I was like, this is going in the New York Times. I have to either do this or I need to have her take it out because it's been, 6 years since I said something. And so I called my best friend, who's just my business sounding board and everything that I do. And she basically just told me exactly what I told you. She was like, you would be an idiot not to do this. And you've been waiting for this your whole life. So why wouldn't you get the proposal together so that when this comes out, you have something in case anyone wants it? And so I wrote the proposal. I basically just spent the next month on round trip flights, like one day to California, just back and forth writing every single day. And then my best friend actually had written a book that had been published the year before. And so she gave me her agent's information. And I sent the proposal to her agent, who agreed to represent me if anyone was interested. And so the piece came out, the Day in the Life piece in the Times came out. And then she posted on social media that day. And I had four publishing houses reach out to her. And I went in for meetings with her the entire next week. And then I sold it on that Friday to Simon & Schuster. And the craziest part about that is that Simon & Schuster is in the same building as Christies. So we have the 5th and 6th floor. And so when I talk and when I give talks about this, I like to say that I've been sitting on top of my dreams for the past 20 years, but I'm the only person who could actually make it happen. And I think that until I realized that I was the person who was going to have to do this, nothing happened. But then as soon as I did, look at what has happened now.
There had to be some movement on your end.
Yeah, there had to be movement and there had to be forward thinking and there had to be really me figuring out what I wanted.
I like that some of the advice you give in the book is to say it, to tell people, give people the idea.
Yeah.
That's how actually I got tons of things in my life. But the big one was I was an evening anchor and I wanted to be a morning anchor. And I just started saying it. And then when that position was open, I got that position. I was the natural fit because I'd been talking about it.
It's such an easy thing. And I don't know why it takes us a long time to realize that. But really, people want to help. I found this in my book tour. I found this even writing the book and the case studies. People reach across the aisle all the time to sort of say, is there anything I can do to help? Could I do a book? Could I do a book party for you? Or even with the case studies, people ask me, how do you know all of these people? I'm like, I knew about a third of the women who were in the case studies in my book. I reached out to people who were killing it in their own industries. And I said to them, who's the most powerful woman that you know? And would you feel comfortable putting me in touch with them? Either writing me an email or writing an email introducing me, or I would be happy to write an email just copying you in. No one said no. Not one person was like, no, I don't feel comfortable doing that. So I just think, again, extend your network, ask outside of the four walls of your sort of office or your home.
What do you hope women get out of this book?
Oh, I just hope women feel like this book, as I said earlier, gives them permission to live the life that they want to live, that it gives them confidence, that it gives them conviction in their voice so they feel like they can ask for things and not feel afraid of the answer.
Since releasing it, you've talked to lots of women. You've talked to women who've read it. You've talked to women at book tours. Tell me, what is something that's stuck with you from these women? What are they saying to you?
I've had a couple of women ask me, how do you find your it? Or how do you know when you found your it? Which is a question that I just love. And I sort of paused and I could ask you the same thing. What was the moment that you found your it? Is this podcast your it, for instance?
That's a good question because I think this is something I go back a lot to because I feel like I was born to be a news anchor, yet I walked away from it. So I've reworked it into being, at least for now, part of the journey.
Yeah. And I think that's the greatest way to say it because your journey will shift and there will be times when, again, as moms, there are times when you want to be more present at home or it makes it impossible for you not to be there or there has to be some balance between you and your partner to make things work out. And I think that's all the part of the conversation, and maybe it is not something that you get every day in your life, but it is something that you can find and maybe what your it was, and maybe it's something that you return to over time, or you craft this into something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I did, when someone asked me that question, I thought it was a really interesting question. And I sort of said, I remember dragging myself 9 months pregnant to take charity auctions. People are like, why are you here? In this sort of like confused voice. And I'm like, because if I'm not here, then what if they don't raise the money that they need? And then what if that one kid doesn't get into a clinical trial because they don't have the funding? And, you take that on as your own, right? That becomes your it.
So you've mentioned a few times that you're a mom of three. Being a mom of three is not easy. But I think that when you are a high-powered person and you're working a job and you have your it and you're showing your kids that you have this it and it is important to pour into yourself and pour into other people, what do you think you're teaching them?
Well, I had a little girl come to a book reading and a book signing in Ohio last week, and she was like 8 years old. And she said to me, what do you do? What do you say to your daughter when you have to come to a book signing? I'm just sort of sitting there. I mean, every mom here is feeling my guilt as I say this. I mean, I'm staring at this little girl, and I'm in Ohio for the night. And, my 6-year-old daughter is never pleased when I'm walking out the door. But I said to her, I say to my daughter, I want you to do whatever you want to do in your life. And I want you to be happy and fulfilled in the role that you're playing, whether that be mom or high-powered executive or anything that you want to do. So you have to see other people do that, right? You need role models. And so that's what I'm trying to be for you. And I also try to include her in my journey. I take her on business trips whenever I can. And I also take her to book signings now. She actually signs people's books as well. I don't know whether or not they need it.
Yeah, so cute.
So I feel like, that those moments make me proud because I look at her and, my little 2-year-old, I have 2 daughters and a son. It's girl, boy, girl. My 2-year-old, she walks around, she goes, mommy's book, whenever she's holding it. And I'm like, there's something really cool about the fact that these girls will grow up knowing that they can be global head of strategic partnerships for Christies auction house. They can be an auctioneer. They can be an author. Like those are 3 more things. Those are 3 paths that did not exist until I started living them. And as a result of the choices that I've made and the life that I'm living, they will have those options. And I think that that's one way to look at it, where you feel like you can be really proud of what you're doing.
I just think you're teaching them so much. I think that's so important. I had that aha moment with my first son when I just wanted to exercise, but I was worried about exercising because I needed to spend that hour with my son. But then I realized the more important thing that was happening was that I was teaching him exercise is important, and that's okay.
Yeah,
totally
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, this podcast is all about joy and happiness. What would be your tip to finding more joy in your life, regardless of the external circumstances?
More than anything, you just have to listen to yourself and what you love and make sure that you're finding time to do it. And that can be in any capacity. I mean, I find as much joy on a Sunday just sitting around with my kids, on a picnic blanket on a sunny day as I do getting on stage, taking an auction. So finding the right moments in my life to make sure that I'm spending as much time with my children as I possibly can, but also finding something fulfilling in my career and also finding time to run because I love running.
Yeah,
that's my perfect sort of joy triangle right there.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I love your podcast.
Lydia is just incredible, isn't she? I had such a fun time talking to her and getting some of the tools she uses in her life. I am linking her book, The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You, in the show notes. I highly recommend it. If you enjoyed this conversation, you are going to love the book. And I want to ask you please to subscribe to the podcast and take a minute to rate it. It really helps me out when you do that. And I want to thank you for being here on Happiness in Progress.